Good afternoon and welcome to the DNR's Floodplain and Shoreline virtual training series. Today's topic is Floodplain Administration 101. My name is Garry Bennett. I'm a floodplain hydrologist. I'm with the DNR's Floodplain Management Program. Co-presenting with me today is Ricky Hoffman. Ricky, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Garry. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Ricky Hoffman. I'm also with the Floodplain as well as the Shoreline program here in the land use unit for the DNR. My background is in local land use and zoning administration, and that's sort of what I do here at the DNR is I support planning efforts for ordinance review and things of that sort for the floodplain and shoreline programs.
Awesome. Thank you, Ricky. And I think Seal Streich, she's not on the call yet, but I think Seal's going to be joining us, so she's going to help monitor the chat, and she'll be available to answer any questions that may come up that Ricky and I can't handle. So with that formality being said, let's kind of dive into our presentation today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about government roles and responsibilities. So I think everybody on this call recognizes that for floodplain management purposes, it's really a collaborative effort between local, state, and federal governments. The permitting authority is the community. So in Minnesota, that's the city, the county, or in some cases, it could be the township. Communities, if they so choose, may enroll in the National Flood Insurance Program. If they do so, they are required to adopt and enforce a floodplain management ordinance. They're going to assist their residents with floodplain management questions, issue those floodplain permits, conduct inspections, and maintain records of all their floodplain development. In Minnesota, we've actually got over 40 watershed districts. I was kind of surprised by that number. It's actually many of them are in the metropolitan area. And most watershed districts have adopted rules and regulations, so they've got a permit program. Watershed districts organize mitigation projects, and they often provide technical assistance to the local unit of government. Now, I mentioned watershed districts may have a permit program. Just be aware if there's a project in the floodplain that requires that watershed district permit, that's in addition to the required floodplain permit that will be issued by the community. The state, in this case, we're talking about the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. The state administers the state floodplain management program. The state provides assistance and training to those communities that have adopted and enforced a floodplain management ordinance. The state must approve all floodplain management ordinances. And we also do monitoring and auditing of communities. So if you've ever been involved in what's called a community assistance contact or CAC, or that community assistance visit or CAV, that's what I mean by some of the monitoring and auditing that the state does. And lastly, it's FEMA. That's the federal agency that oversees the National Flood Insurance Program. Of course, FEMA identifies flood risk by producing the flood insurance rate maps. And FEMA also provides floodplain management training. Let's talk a little bit about ordinances. Local ordinances state that a permit is required for all development in the floodplain. And those local ordinances define development very broadly. The FEMA definition that we're looking at here, they define development as any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation or drilling operations, or the storage of equipment or materials. So as you can see, it's a very broad definition of development. If you can read the fine print in the lower right-hand corner, it says this definition supersedes local building code exemptions. Probably the most common building code exemption that we see is the state building code exemption for those small sheds less than 200 square feet in size. So just be aware if you've got one of those small sheds and it happens to be in the floodplain, it's considered development and you're going to be requiring a permit for that. So even though local ordinances state that a permit is required for all floodplain development, it doesn't specify what type of a permit. So your community may be issuing a building permit, that land alteration permit, maybe you call it a floodplain permit, or in some cases it could even be that DNR public waters work permit if the work is primarily below the ordinary high water level. So whatever permit your community is using, they're all okay, provided that you're still reviewing the project against your ordinance and verifying that it's compliant with those allowable uses and standards. Also, in the lower, speaking of those small sheds, you might consider waiving fees for development that wouldn't otherwise require permits. So I do want to mention that for those small sheds less than 200 square feet in size. The DNR does have a sample permit application form. It's available for viewing and download on our website. It's a very comprehensive application form. It really includes all the relevant information and standards that floodplain administrators would need in order to make an informed permit decision. It also creates a record for exactly what is being approved. And we'll spend a little bit more time looking at the application here later on today. So I know I just got done saying that a permit is required for all floodplain development, but FEMA recognizes that there are some projects or some development that are so minor that it's really not going to need a permit. So FEMA says that insignificant uses that will not create obstructions or have an impact on flood flows, such as planting a garden, farming, or putting up a mailbox, do not need a permit. That also includes routine maintenance. So for instance, if someone wants to paint their house that's in the floodplain, as well as the continuation of existing uses. And some of the images we show on the slide here, like tiling, oftentimes tiling doesn't require a permit, particularly if they're going to backfill the trench, so they're going to restore those contours to the original condition. We also show a flagpole. Projects like that, they're insignificant in most cases and don't need a permit. Recreational vehicles, if they're in the floodplain, they also do not require a permit, provided they are travel ready. And your ordinance states that travel ready means that they are fully licensed. They're on wheels. They're clearly ready to go. They're mobile. You could pull up a truck and pull the trailer out, or if it's an RV, you can just fire it up and drive off. They must be equipped with those quick disconnect utilities for water, sewer, and electrical. And they certainly can't have something permanently attached to them. So if you can see this image on the lower right-hand corner, that's a travel trailer that has looks like a permanently attached deck. So that clearly is not travel ready. They're going to have to do some work to make that travel ready. So if you happen to have a travel trailer or RV that's got those permanently attached fixtures, those are going to require a permit if they're located in the floodplain. For the rest of the presentation, Ricky and I, we're going to be talking about the typical permitting process. And we're primarily going to focus on buildings, but we're also going to talk about some of the permit requirements for those non-structural developments. So we're going to walk you through the steps of that typical permit process. The first step being, is it even in the floodplain? If it is in the floodplain, what floodplain district is it located in? Does the proposal meet your ordinance standards? Then we're going to talk about the permit review. That's the stage where you're getting ready to actually issue the permit and just verifying that you've got all the correct information needed to make that permit decision. And then lastly, after the permit's been issued, we're going to talk a little bit about inspections and as-built documentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ricky.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. So I'm going to take that a stab at that first section here, which is determining if a project site is in the floodplain. What we do to primarily use to do that is our flood maps that FEMA provides. We also do have quite a bit of other materials that we use beyond FEMA's published maps to kind of what we refer to as best available data to help determine whether a site is in the floodplain or not. Admittedly, I think a lot of folks that work in local government probably work in a county or a jurisdiction that downloads their GIS data from FEMA's Map Service Center and incorporates that into their own GIS products. But if you don't, and we certainly encourage that, that makes sense from a organizational standpoint to incorporate that into your workflow, however you see fit. But for the purposes of those that don't have that incorporated into their own processes, we do have this Find Our Flood Maps webpage out on the DNR's website. That's a QR code to it, as well as there's a link. Once we send out the PDFs, that link up in the visit this page portion of the slide provides a link to that. This graphic on the left-hand side there is a visual representation of what mapping products exist out on a county-by-county basis throughout the state. You can see most counties have those blue, indicated by blue shading D firms, those digital firms. That's the majority of counties in Minnesota. I'm sure that there are folks on the line as well as Seal that remember a time where that wasn't the case, that we had majority D firms throughout the state. The folks that are in, or the counties that are in green shaded counties are the paper map versions. We still do have some of those in the state, as well as some of those unmapped counties that are shaded in that gray. I do want to mention and point out the kind of squiggly, what seemingly squiggly pink lines on this page. Those are our estimated 1% surface water elevations. They're in a lot of our counties that have digital products, and those are used as sort of that best available data for determining base flood elevations. So if you are in a county that has those, I would highly recommend you familiarize yourself if you haven't already. And those are provided out on our Lake and Flood Elevation Viewer online tool, which I think the next slide points to that. Yeah, this is a screenshot from the DNR's Lake and Flood Elevation online tool. Again, this is available out on our webpage. The QR will send you to colloquially known as Elfio, but it'll bring you to that web page. It's just like your traditional GIS viewer. You can use the tools to navigate either by search bar to your location, or you can kind of zoom and pan into the area in question. And again, the big thing that I want to point out here, I don't know if it's shown on this, or maybe the coloring's a little bit different, but this is again where you would go to find those pink lines. So the Elfio is going to essentially show the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer or layer on an aerial with, and it brings in some other layers that the firms don't, the digital firms don't provide, such as contours and things like that. But essentially, it is just those digital firms displayed on an aerial. And but the one thing that I do want to point out is those pink lines. You won't find those. Those aren't published on FEMA's digital firms. And so if you're looking for those as sort of a source of data for establishing your base flood elevations, the Lake and Flood Elevation Online tool is where you're going to want to go. All right, next slide. So this is an important piece to kind of set the stage, right? So in determining whether or not a site is in or out of the floodplain, and when we say floodplain, we really mean the special flood hazard area. So those zones that we're regulating on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. The state rules, which is specific to Minnesota, you won't find this in the federal regulations, say that when a conflict exists between the floodplain, basically what's mapped on the firm, and the actual field conditions, so those ground elevations, the governing factor will be the regulatory floodplain limit, so that base flood elevation. So what we mean by that, and I think, Gary, if you click, I think it'll show that the next site on the slide. Yeah, there we go. So when you look at this example, these two home sites, you can see clearly home site 2 is very high and dry in terms of ground elevation, up above the 920 contour mark, but it's mapped in, right? So we regulate it. Our ordinances apply to that home site, but this is probably a instance where a letter of map amendment is appropriate for an instance where a home site has ground elevations that are, clearly up and above the base flood elevation. However, for proposed site number 1, it's adjacent to the mapped area, but it's low lying, right? It's below that base flood elevation. And what are the rule that's up on the screen and what our floodplain ordinances are going to require is that you regulate those areas that are adjacent to the mapped area and below based on the ground contours. We're basically ground truthing the mapped portion of the floodplain to be consistent with those regulatory elevations for flood protection. All right, next slide. So let's use that in a scenario. This is a Zone A riverine flooding scenario. And we have a home site that's adjacent to the mapped floodplain. Again, the Zone A is not going to show published base flood elevations on the map, nor does it have a delineated floodway. In this instance, again, using, either one, I can describe it on either slide. But in this instance, we're going to use that previous slide's sort of methodology to determine, are we truly out of the floodplain based on that regulatory flood elevation? In the A zone circumstance, again, we don't have those published base flood elevations on the flood insurance rate map, but we are in a situation where we have pink lines, so those estimated 1% water surface elevations. And if we use sort of a conservative upstream number, so the 1310.5 elevation as our assumed base flood elevation, we're going to go ahead and use that number and sort of correspond it to the edge of the mapped floodplain as it's adjacent to the home site. And we can see that that's roughly around the 1310.5 mark. So in this case, we're confident that that mapped floodplain boundary is accurate to the regulatory elevation, and therefore we can comfortably reason that this home site is out of the floodplain, and therefore the floodplain regulations don't apply. And this is just a graphic kind of showing those elevation requirements. Not only is it showing that regulatory flood protection elevation standard, but it's also showing the shoreline, what we refer to as the shoreline method of minimum elevations. So for those communities that have a shoreline ordinance, you would want to sort of cross-reference and keep in mind that you have these sort of not conflicting, but supporting standards out of your shoreline ordinance that require that 3 feet above the ordinary high or highest known water level. So to summarize that, if we have a known regulatory flood protection elevation, we would use that. But for those areas where we don't know that, we would apply that 3 foot above the ordinary high or highest known water level. And keep in mind that in those areas where we have high areas of high elevations, where a home site, the ground elevation maybe extends well above the BFE, we're making sure that they're not constructing in a way where they would be digging down and building a basement or crawl space that would go below that regulatory flood protection elevation. All right, I think I'm all wrapped up for this section.
Okay, thanks, Ricky. So the next step is to determine the floodplain district. The reason that's important is the allowable uses and the standards that are associated with those uses, they're going to vary depending upon the floodplain district that the project is located in. Most local ordinances are going to have at least one, if not all three of these floodplain districts. And I'll just describe each of these. The first one is the floodway district. This is the most restrictive district. It's defined as those areas within the Zone AE floodplain, so a detailed study area, and where the project is located or is within a delineated floodway as shown on the flood insurance rate map. The flood fringe district, this is the district where we're going to see most of the development, and it's defined as those areas within Zone AE floodplains where the project is located outside of the delineated floodway as shown on the flood insurance rate map. The third one we've got here is the general floodplain district, and this one's a little bit different. It's those areas within Zone A or AE that do not have a floodway delineated as shown on the flood insurance rate map. So the real key is on the floodplain maps, if they don't show a floodway, it's general floodplain district, regardless of the zone, regardless of whether it's Zone A or detailed study area Zone AE. If it doesn't have that floodway mapped, it's general floodplain district. Oh, and there is a fourth district. I don't show it here. We've got coastal floodplain district up in St. Louis County, but we're just not we're gonna forget that exists for today's presentation. So let's look at a few examples. In this case, it's a detailed study area. So you can see FEMA's, it's detailed study because FEMA identified it as Zone AE. The E means we've got elevation. So FEMA's established those base flood elevations. And in this particular case, they've actually mapped the floodway. The floodway is that red and blue hatched area. And we just went over the definition. So we know that flood fringe district are those areas in the floodplain but outside of the floodway. So let's take a look at our first building site. You can see it's in the floodplain, but it's not in the floodway. It's outside. We can also clearly see this is a backwater area. This is like a wetland or a pond. So we're not anticipating that we're going to see any velocities or effective flow areas. So because it's in the floodplain, but outside of the mapped floodway as shown on the flood insurance rate map, we know this is flood fringe district. Let's look at another example. Here's a building site, and we can see that it's in the 0.2% annual chance floodplain, otherwise known as the 500-year floodplain. And most communities in Minnesota do not regulate the 500-year floodplain, but we do have some that do. If you're a community that regulates the 500-year floodplain, just be aware that that's going to be considered flood fringe district. The last building site I've got is this one in the lower right-hand corner. And you can see that it's in or touching the floodway. Again, the floodway being that red and blue hatched area. And because it's so close, this is a situation where you're going to want to verify that the floodplain boundary is accurate based on LIDAR or other topographic data like Ricky just explained. But if this one happens to be, if it's accurate and it's shown to be in the floodway, that's going to be considered floodway district. And of course, if they're proposing a building, we know that new buildings aren't allowed in the floodway. So we're going to make sure they're in the flood fringe. But this particular case, that would be floodway district, the way it's shown on the map. Okay, let's look at an A zone example. And in fact, this is the exact same example that Ricky was just sharing with you. We can see it's zone A because on the flood insurance rate map, FEMA has identified it as zone A. And we can take a look at the floodplain and we can see FEMA clearly did not delineate a floodway. So we know this is general floodplain district. Now that same house that Ricky was sharing with you, let's say that they changed their mind and they actually want to get a little bit closer to the river. So now we can see they're actually proposing to develop this building, this house in the floodplain. Now that's something that we may be able to issue, but because it's general floodplain district, there are additional requirements that must be met before we can issue that permit. So let's talk a little bit about those zone A requirements. If it's a zone and it's general floodplain district, the first thing that we need to determine is the base flood elevation. Remember, it's an A zone, so FEMA has not established base flood elevations either on the flood insurance rate map or in the flood insurance study. So that's where you're going to have to use some of those best available data situations where that might be LFIO, like Ricky was explaining, or in some cases you may need to reach out to the DNR, talk to your area hydrologist, or talk to SEAL or myself, and we can provide you with that base flood elevation. And the reason that's important is, of course, the top of the lowest floor is going to need to be elevated to that regulatory flood protection elevation, and we need to know the base flood elevation in order to do that calculation. The second consideration that we need to think about when reviewing a permit for a building in a zone general floodplain district is we're gonna have to determine, where is the floodway and that flood fringe boundary. FEMA certainly hasn't determined that for us. It's not shown on the flood insurance rate map. So typically that means the applicant's going to have to hire an engineer to actually delineate that floodway boundary. And the reason that's important is, as we talked about, new buildings aren't allowed in the floodway. So it's very important that we determine where is the floodway versus the flood fringe and making sure that they're properly siting that house. Or it's possible in some situations to utilize other acceptable alternative methods, what we call standard engineering practices. When those are used, they must be approved by the DNR. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those on the next slide. So as I mentioned, in determining the floodway flood fringe boundary, if they're hiring an engineer, a licensed engineer, that's typically going to require modeling in order to delineate the floodway boundary. And that's probably the most common method, is that we're just going to rely on an engineer, a licensed professional engineer, to prepare a report and determine where that floodway is located. But as I mentioned, there's also some instances where we may use those alternative methods, those standard engineering practices, to delineate the floodway boundary. Again, DNR really must approve those. And some of those methods include, if it's on a lake or a basin, and some of your local ordinances may actually include some of this language, but if it's on a lake or basin, we can use that ordinary high water level as the floodway flood fringe boundary. So floodplain areas above the OHW, and that's the ordinary high water level, those could be considered flood fringe. And then those floodplain areas below the OHW would be considered floodway. As we talked about, there are some situations where it's clearly backwater. We know there's not going to be velocities or effective flows, and it's a judgment call. But it's really a judgment call that the DNR should make to verify that, yeah, we agree this is not an effective flow area. This is flood fringe. And when you kind of get an eye for it, it becomes easier and easier to pick out what those backwater situations look like. But again, please review that with the DNR before making that determination if using that methodology. The last one we've got is those building sites if they're immediately upstream or downstream of a bridge. So as I think most folks can conceptualize, the floodway actually constricts as it goes into a bridge or a culvert, and then it expands as it goes downstream of a bridge or culvert. And that creates ineffective flow areas, areas where the floodplain doesn't really have velocity. It might just pond or in some cases it may eddy. And that provides the possibility for flood fringe. Again, if they're close to a bridge on the upstream or downstream side, yeah, I encourage you to reach out to your DNR area hydrologist or talk with Seal and myself, and we can help you make that determination if it's flood fringe or floodway. And I threw in this slide. This is for non-structural development. So when I say non-structural, I'm talking about it's not a building. Yeah, it might be the placement of fill. It might be excavation. It could be somebody that wants to install a fence. That type of non-structural development. If that's in an A zone, general floodplain district, something the applicant must provide to the zoning administrator is documentation that that encroachment will not cause more than a half a foot of stage increase for the 100-year flood, or actually less than a half of a foot if they would impact insurable buildings. That's what we call the encroachment analysis. That typically means they're going to hire an engineer, much as they would for that floodway flood fringe delineation. And it's similar methodology, but they're typically going to hire an engineer to prepare a report to determine how much stage increase is that encroachment going to cause. And that's what we call that allowable rise. You might have heard that terminology. But there are, like everything, there are some exceptions to that. The one main exception would be if the project is restoring contours or the grade to a previous condition. That's when we may consider using alternative methods to do this encroachment analysis. So the most common example might be if it's an erosional site and they're just going to restore the contours to that previous uneroded condition. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ricky.
All right. So we've gone through, just to kind of recap, we've gone through the process of reviewing the map, determining if the project is in the floodplain, more specifically the regulated portion of the floodplain, the special flood hazard area. We've determined the district, and now we need to determine what applicable ordinance standards apply to the project. This slide kind of anticipates the fact that our floodplain management standards are they're made up of permitted and conditionally permitted uses, right? So if you're using something that kind of reflects the state's model ordinance, this is how it's broken down in our floodway and flood fringe districts. We regulate uses much more rigidly in the floodway district, and then we regulate the design characteristics of certain types of structures via conditionally or permitted outright uses in both of those districts. In the case of floodway developments, right? So if you've determined that your project is in a floodway district, again, the uses are fairly restrictive. The floodway is intended to be that area that we're preserving for conveyance of floodwaters. And therefore, the regulations are designed to really preserve that area. It's therefore the uses are restricted. There are some uses that are permitted and conditionally permitted, which are outlined in your ordinance. And for the most part, new buildings are not allowed. And the predominant performance standard that we apply in the floodway districts are those sort of encroachment standard requirements, depending on whether or not it's an AE or A zone. We're applying that no rise or allowable rise standard and ensuring that the applicant is demonstrating that as part of the documentation within their permit. Otherwise, if they're not, then they would be submitting for a letter of map revision. Generally, we call this our Section 4 standards. That refers to the Section 4 in our state's model floodplain ordinance. They are standards and requirements that apply to all development, irregardless of what district you're in. Now, oftentimes these standards can be sort of the most nebulous and difficult and challenging for zoning administrators to apply because they're a little bit less tangible than applying a property line setback or elevating a structure to a specific elevation standard. These provisions, again, apply to all development, and we oftentimes utilize certain policy guidance to apply these. So a good example of that is the second provision on the screen, which is flood resistant materials below the RFPE. What is flood resistant materials, right? FEMA has a technical bulletin that kind of in very specific detail lists and goes through the process of what is considered flood resistant materials for the purposes of administering your floodplain permit. And we would recommend that if you have questions about these standards as it applies to a specific process, please reach out to the DNR. We sort of help interpret and administer these provisions of ordinances all the time. And we have good tools that we can point you to kind of help put sideboards around what these specifically mean for your specific circumstance. So in the case of residential structures, I guess, in this instance, we're shifting away from the floodway district. As we mentioned, new residential structures, for the most part, new structures in general are not allowed in the floodway. So in the case of residential structures being placed in the flood fringe, we don't regulate uses in the flood fringe, so to speak, right? We don't list out a category of uses in general that we generally permit or conditionally permit in the flood fringe. What the flood fringe revolves around is what are the elevation and floodproofing methods, the design methods in which we are allowing structures to be established or placed in the flood fringe. And the one that comes up most often are for residential structures. We have those two elevation methods that are permitted and conditionally permitted. So generally what state law allows for is elevation on fill being that permitted and primary mode or method of elevating structures. And then all other methods, which we'll go through in a following slide or a subsequent slide, are permitted via conditional use permit. Now I'll mention real briefly that previous versions of the state's floodplain ordinance, I believe, had the standard applied to all structures, residential or non-residential, and that's since been changed and updated. This only applies in state law to residential structures. Non-residential, you don't have to process a conditional use permit for applying alternative methods of elevating those structures. This is a graphic. It's a busy graphic, but it's a good graphic that kind of represents that residential elevation process. So in this case, we're elevating on fill. You can see the line that's kind of right where the slab of the home is showing that regulatory flood protection elevation and the lowest floor being elevated to that. And then I guess the big thing that I want to kind of mention here is the fill. The standard is that the fill is being placed in a way where the fill extends 15 feet beyond the building footprint, and that 15-foot point beyond the footprint, the fill is at a point where it is at or above the base flood elevation. These are graphics kind of showing the other alternative, what we refer to as alternative methods to elevating a residential structure on fill, or a structure on fill for that matter. These, again, for residential structures are going to be required to be processed or permitted via conditional use permit. For non-residential structures, that's not a requirement. The standards for these generally need to meet FEMA's Technical Bulletin 1 for floodproofing. And one other thing I'd mention here is for the middle of the three graphics, the above grade enclosed area, notice that the area inside of the crawl space is at or higher than the grade exterior to that stem wall. If the grade inside of that crawl space was below, FEMA would define that as a basement, and that's not permittable. This is just a screenshot of the definition of lowest floor. The lowest floor obviously being that spot that's required to meet the regulatory flood protection elevation. But I think the thing we want to mention here is the fact that we have a carve out in that definition for those areas below the first or below the lowest floor that are being used solely for the purposes of storage, parking, and access can be exempt from that lowest floor requirement. Your tuck under garages can be used in as an alternative method of elevating. So again, your ordinance is going to require this to be permitted through a conditional use permit, and that area below what's defined as the lowest floor must be used solely for parking, storage, and access to the main floor. And of course, that area needs to meet all those general provisions that apply to all areas of the floodplain, making sure that it's generally resistant, made of resistant materials, and the utilities are being elevated, and so on and so forth. Accessory structures. So these are those smaller structures, generally limited to, in our most recent version of our state model, limited to 600 square feet. Most of you probably have a different, I think for quite a while we had a provision of 572 square feet, which I think is, or 576 square feet, which I think is a 24 by 24 garage. It's generally those structures that are going to be limited to that square footage. These structures can be flood-proofed via a number of different methods. They aren't required to be processed via a conditional use permit like residential structures are. They can be wet flood-proofed. Again, that's limited to parking and storage, similar to those like tuck under garages like we talked about in the previous slide. They can be elevated on fill. They can be elevated via those alternative methods, or dry flood proofed. This is a graphic showing that wet flood proofing process, or generally just kind of outlining what a wet flood proofed accessory structure would look like. So in this case, we've got those areas below the RFPE have flood openings. It's anchored so as to not be subject to that hydrodynamic and or hydrostatic pressures from the floodwaters. It's built with flood-resistant materials. The utilities have been elevated above the RFPE. So this is a good example of what a wet flood-proof structure might look like. And again, it's limited to that 600 square foot. Yep, flood openings. And I will mention too, this is, again, we're under the assumption that this is in the flood fringe. These types of structures would not be permitted in the floodway. This is a sort of a great segue to that. Oftentimes you'll see these as common examples of accessory structures not meeting local floodplain regulations. So from going from left to right on the screen, you've got your duck blind. That's sort of a more permanent duck blind structure that's being placed clearly within what I perceive to be a floodway. That is not permitted. They would, if they needed to hunt in that location, they would need to do something much more temporary in terms of a blind setup. The middle one is your kind of tiny house example where they took a small shed and modified it into a residential structure. Again, these types of structures are limited to storage and parking, and shouldn't be finished into any type of or used for any type of residential use. And then the graphic on the right is a outbuilding that was converted into what's looks like an outhouse. And again, we want to apply those general provisions out of what we refer to as Section 2 of our model ordinance, where we wouldn't want to be placing sanitary facilities such as an outhouse in the floodplain, so as to convey sewage and other hazardous materials during flood events.
Okay, and that's back to me. So you've completed your review, and now you're getting ready to issue the permits. But let's go back to the permit application form. Before you issue that permit, you want to make sure you've got everything documented and that the information you've got is compliant with your ordinance. So the first thing we're going to look at, and a lot of this is what we already covered, you're going to verify in your application, and these are the portions of the application that's going to need to be completed by the zoning administrator. So we've already talked about, is it in the floodplain? In this case, yes. Is it in the floodplain district, or what floodplain district is it located in? In this case, it's the flood fringe. Is it an allowable use? You decided, yeah, it's not. It doesn't require a CUP, so it is a permitted use. If it's a building, we're going to have to calculate the regulatory flood protection elevation. So as a reminder, the RFPE is that base flood elevation, the elevation of the 100-year floodplain, plus the floodway stage increase, which can be up to a half a foot, plus the required freeboard, which in Minnesota is always 1 foot. And in this case, we calculated an RFPE of 1092.3. And we're going to note the datum, the vertical datum that was used, as well as the BFE source. We're also going to look at the construction plans that were submitted with this application and verify that all of the proposed applications are meeting the requirements of our ordinance. So for instance, the top of the lowest floor, we're going to look at the construction plans. We're going to verify that that proposed top of lowest floor is at or above our RFPE of 1092.3. We're going to look at the construction plans or the grading plans and verify that the lowest, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but that lowest adjacent grade is meeting our ordinance requirements. The ordinance says if they're elevating on fill, that fill elevation is at least to the base foot elevation plus the stage increase. So in this case, it's that 1091.3. Moving back to my second item, we're going to verify that the lowest elevation of any electrical, gas, or ductwork, those utilities, are they also elevated above the RFPE? Or if they're below the RFP, are they flood proofed? Things of that nature. I'll skip to the last one here, the lowest point of road access. Some ordinances may have that in it. I think the standard is that the lowest point for the road access can be no more than 2 feet below the RFP. So in this case, it's 1090.3. And we're going to want to verify, if we've got that in our ordinance, we're going to verify that proposed elevation is sufficient. And again, we're going to note the vertical datum used and make sure all of the datums when we're comparing elevations that we're using the same vertical datum, comparing those apples to apples. Let's say it's not new construction. What if it's an existing nonconformity? And instead of, like I said, instead of new construction, they're going to propose maybe it's an addition or other improvement. So you're going to have to look at evaluating project cost to determine, is it a substantial improvement or if it's repairs they're making because the building was damaged for a non-conforming structure, is it substantially damaged? So in this case, we're going to be comparing the cost of the improvements, in this case, a little over $15,000, to that pre-improved or pre-damaged market value of the structure, which we've got down at $105,000. And we've got a formula that helps you walk you through that process. But in this case, it was just under 15%. So the proposed improvement was 15%. I guess in summary, we're documenting the cost of improvements for repair. We're comparing those against the market value and ensuring that they're less than 50% of the market value. Anything in excess of 50% would be substantial improvement or substantial damage. But we're not done yet. Most ordinances require, well, I think all ordinances require cumulative tracking for at least a 365-day period for those for improvements. And some communities actually have, as a higher standard, they may require cumulative tracking for 10 years, or in some cases, even the life of the structure. So at the very least, we know we're looking at 365-day period. What other improvements might they have done? But if you're a community that has a higher standard, maybe you're tracking a 10-year period, you're going to have to take a look at what other improvements have they done. So in this example, in 2004, they constructed a new deck and the community permitted it. That was a 10% improvement. Okay, that's fine. Then in 2016, they did another addition. In this case, that was a 32% improvement. So when you add that to 10%, they're up to 42%. They don't have a lot more room before it's going to be considered substantial improvement. So recently, let's say this year, they apply to install a sunroom. And we just did the calculation. It's just under 15%. We can't permit that. That would exceed 50%. It's actually 56.9%. So we cannot permit that because it's a substantial improvement unless they bring the entire building into compliance. In many cases, because it's a non-conforming structure, that may mean elevating it so the top to the lowest floor is at or above the RFPE. Or in some cases, and this is kind of the exception, we may have a nonconformity that's in the floodway. And if they do a substantial improvement and the building's in the floodway, they're actually going to have to shift that building foundation and move it outside of the floodway to be compliant. Talking about non-structural development. So again, if they're not constructing a building, but we're talking about filling, grading, or other obstructions like a fence, those are common examples. If they're in the floodway, the applicant should be providing the zoning administrator with that no-rise certification that's typically completed by an engineer, signed off by an engineer, where they're basically stating that the proposed encroachment, that proposed floodplain development that's in the floodway, is not going to cause more than a 0.00 foot stage increase for the 100-year flood elevation. There's an asterisk at the bottom. You can see that's not needed if returning the site to a previous condition. So that's one of those situations if they're simply restoring contours to a previous condition, that's where we can apply those standard engineering practices or those alternative practices. We still need to document that it's a no-rise, but that wouldn't require hiring an engineer to do modeling. What about substantial damage? We talked a little bit about that already, but if it's damage, and this is not just damage due to flooding, this could be damage due to a tornado, a hailstorm, wind damage, fire, damage from any cause. If they're doing repairs, we need to, as a zoning administrator, we need to do those substantial damage determinations. So again, verifying that the cost of the repairs aren't exceeding 50% of the market value of the pre-damaged structure. We do have our Minnesota post-flood substantial damage playbook for local officials, and that was recently updated in June of 2022, and that goes into much more detail on actually what that substantial damage determination process is. I will add that if your community has a flooding event, and we know, or you've got many structures that have been damaged due to flooding, please be prepared to have a huge permitting demand. And if you know you've got numerous structures that were damaged, as soon as that flood event is over and it's safe to go out there and start doing those substantial damage determinations and doing assessments, that's when you're going to want to have to start doing that and dig out this playbook. So real quickly, just a few communication tips to have during permitting. Of course, communicate the flood risk. When you're reviewing a project proposal with the applicant, you let them know they're in the floodplain. And it's also important to maybe let them know that if they construct in the floodplain, there's approximately a 25% chance over a 30-year mortgage that they may experience flooding of some magnitude. Also talk about alternatives. I know us with the DNR, we've reviewed many projects where if they only would have moved the footprint of the project, maybe 10, 20, 50 feet, if they've got higher ground on their parcel to build that's outside of the floodplain, those should be serious considerations, and let the property owner know that may be in their best interest. Communicate the implications of flood insurance. If they, despite all of our best efforts to get them to construct outside of the floodplain, they want to build in the floodplain, let them know that if they've got a federally backed mortgage and they're in the floodplain, they're FEMA and the federal government by law says that they must have a flood insurance policy. And I think we all know that flood insurance, just insurance in general, is getting to be very expensive. So that's certainly a consideration. Encourage the property owner to work with knowledgeable surveyors, engineers, and architects. I think that goes without saying. We probably can't cherry pick the ones we like, but if we can provide them a list of reputable surveyors and engineers, that may be in everybody's best interest. Help the applicant complete the permit application form. Floodplain management, we use a lot of acronyms and terms, and a lot of times the permit applicant has no idea what that means, or they may be working with a surveyor, but yeah, certainly help those folks out if they have questions. And we do encourage, and certainly you should encourage applicants to complete a FEMA elevation certificate. Although a FEMA elevation certificate is no longer required for flood insurance rating purposes, what we have found is those folks that do an elevation certificate, they oftentimes still get a reduced flood insurance premium. So cheaper flood rates or flood insurance rates with the elevation certificate.
Alrighty, I'm gonna take us forward with inspection and as-built. I am gonna kind of boogie through this. Don't think that it's because we don't feel that this should be important or have an emphasis on it. I'm just trying to be respectful of our ending time here. So inspections and as-built. Inspections, what I want to sort of impress upon folks on this call is they're important, they're highly encouraged, and oftentimes they are the difference between having to have a really difficult post-construction conversation with a contractor or property owner versus a, hey, could you modify your forms and bring this site up a little bit more with some fill or higher stem walls. Two very different conversations, and oftentimes inspections can really help that. So, and then as-built, they're required via your ordinance. They're required to be collected to document the flood protection elevations being met in terms of all regulatory standards, including utilities, lowest floors, and so on and so forth, and keeping those and having good forms to collect that information, and keeping them with your permit documentation for in perpetuity, or for at least for the life of the structure, are important. And take pictures, right? They can say a lot of things about how the structure was compliant that might be useful 5, 10, 15 years down the road for a number of different reasons. Here's an example of FEMA's elevation certificate. It's only required for CRS communities to collect it on this form. Currently have your own form. It is sort of regulatorily compliant with all of the data points that are necessary for meeting your floodplain standards. I don't think that they're required to be submitted anymore for LOMAs. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that they don't require elevation certificates to be submitted for them. But they're oftentimes collected for the purposes of insurance, or used to kind of help determinations for those required insurance policies. For lenders. And so we encourage you, if you are looking for a form, we encourage you to use FEMA's elevation certificate. Common permitting oversights. I'm not going to read all these through, but things like not processing a conditional use permit when the alternative elevation method was required to go that route, and things like that. Consider these things, familiarize yourself with your floodplain ordinance. I think a lot of these things can be communicated through your DNR supporting staff, our central office staff, Seal, Garry, myself, or your area hydrologist. If you have good communication, a lot of these things can kind of be avoided in terms of your permitting process. And having good forms that kind of walk you through that process is helpful too, as we kind of mentioned in earlier slides. Legal implications. Simply put, with this is, oftentimes litigation matters come up when there's after the fact, the permitting's been done 5 years down the road, maybe a structure was damaged, right? And in our experience, and again, what we want to impress upon you is irregardless of what damage has occurred, the regulations might have been administered completely correctly, and the structure might have still been damaged. The reality is that in our experience, courts give deference to local governments if they can clearly demonstrate that they follow their regulations. So all the more important reason to have a good permitting process, document that the structure was built and permitted in accordance with your regulation, and you will often find yourself on the side of good standing when these litigation issues come up.
Okay, well, with 2 minutes left, other administrative considerations, and I think I'm going to skip most of these. Let's just go right to, so just be aware that if DNR is issuing a permit for a project that's primarily below the ordinary high water level and within the floodplain, you don't need to replicate that effort. So a local permit's not needed if DNR is issuing a public waters permit. This slide shows you an example. So the yellow is a Zone A floodplain, the blue is a public water course. So first site, yes, it's a public water course, it's floodplain. DNR is issuing a permit. You don't need a local permit for that. But this site, it's still map floodplain, but you can see the public water course ends at this road crossing. So this one's going to require a local permit. So please keep that in mind. And there are a number of situations where a DNR permit may not be required, and not only could it be not a public water course, it could be exempt because it's an in-place replacement. There's a number of situations, so just be aware that if a DNR is not issuing a permit and it's in a floodplain, you're issuing that local permit. And I see we're at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to leave you guys with other resources. We talked about most of these, but please check these out. DNR's floodplain management website. We've got a page on regulations. We've got our training and education page where we've got a number of recordings you can view. A quick plug for the Minnesota Quick Guide. That's a useful resource. Everybody should have that bookmarked. It could probably answer most of your questions without reaching out to DNR. And then lastly, I know Ricky talked about the Lake and Flood Elevation Online tool. So that should be your go-to for viewing the floodplain, the flood insurance rate maps. And that's it. Thank you, everybody.